I call Chris Fartfoy.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Thank you very much. Interesting to see the government taking such short calls on this piece of legislation, but we might try and use the 10 minutes to canvass a number of issues around this piece of legislation. Connectivity, Mr Speaker, is a very important issue. I think you only need to see what happens to consumers when they lose their connectivity and lose their minds as to how important it is to both businesses and the average Kiwi at home, and making sure that you do have connectivity to the internet, obviously extremely important. Extremely important in an electorate like mine in Mana too, Mr Speaker. I have the pleasure of sitting on the local board of the Computers in Homes a board locally for Porirua, and at the moment, because of the cost of broadband connections, we're currently looking at different ways of being able to offer broadband connectivity or internet connectivity to communities like that of Waitangiroa and Cannons Creek, because we know that if those families in those areas and the children in those areas don't have the ability to connect to the internet, they'll be at a distinct disadvantage to other families and other children that do. So it is certainly an extremely important issue. This piece of legislation, though, Mr Speaker, though, is the kind of bill that you get when a government doesn't use its taringas. They should have listened about 2 to 3 years ago when this issue first arose, when the UFB rollout began, and people started contacting their local MPs. And they said to us, hey, we've got an issue with a right-of-way or a body corporate. We can't connect up to the internet because of this. There's one curmudgeon in amongst the lot who is not letting us connect to the internet. So we can't connect. Now, I'm connected. I think most of us are connected. And I think you can all agree just how frustrating it would be if you lived in an apartment and one person perhaps was holding this up. But as I say, Mr Speaker, this issue is not new. This was around 2 to 3, potentially 4 years ago. And I think at the time when I was on the Commerce Select Committee, we had a number of submitters come to us when we were discussing a piece of broadband-related legislation, saying, hey, we've got this issue around connectivity, around right-of-ways, around body corporates. So it was a live issue then, and my colleague Claire Curran was extremely hot on this issue, saying to the government, what are you going to do this? Because if you're talking about making sure as many New Zealanders can be connected to the UFB, we could potentially have a big problem, and potentially in some of our biggest, in our biggest city of Auckland, where we do have a lot of apartment living, a lot of shared dwellings and right-of-ways, where you could have an enormous number of people not being able to connect. And we had the likes of the telecommunications companies come to us and say, hey guys, this is an issue, we can't do this, there's property rights at play, and fair enough, because this is where the legislation sits now, but we might need to address this issue relatively quickly so we can make sure that people can get connected. And to those people at home who aren't connected because of this issue, I would like you just to see just how responsive this government is to those needs that they had back 2 to 3 to 4 years ago. You have waited not weeks, not months, but years for this issue to be addressed in this House. As I say, this is not a new issue. Can I also have a little bit of sympathy for the minister who is responsible for this piece of legislation? Who doesn't want more New Zealanders to be connected to the internet? And that's what this piece of legislation does. But she was passed a huge hospital pass by Stephen Joyce, and I acknowledge the contribution of Gareth Hughes that he made earlier, because Stephen Joyce sat on this problem for years. And then at the election, when election time came around, and Amy Adams, who I have a lot of respect for, took over the telecommunications portfolio, there was a big issue here, and she is the one that has to front the legislation. Because Stephen Joyce didn't have his eyes across the detail when the ultra-fast broadband rollout was proposed. He didn't have his eyes across the detail when this issue came across the table at the Select Committee. He ignored the thousands of people who I'm sure have been affected by this, saying we can't get connected, and he left Amy Adams to pick up the pieces. So I do have a certain amount of sympathy for that minister who is responsible for this legislation, because Stephen Joyce, the previous Minister of Telecommunications, either ignored or willfully ignored this issue, or just said, hey, I'm not going to be the minister anymore, not my problem. But we've got this piece of legislation that hopes to fix that issue, and I guess in some way we have to give some acknowledgement to the government that is actually doing something about this. It might be years later, but that's the situation we're in, Mr. Speaker. So, what does this piece of legislation actually do to solve the problem of people who are in a situation where, because they have a body corporate or right-of-way, or someone else has a right to the carriageway or the land where you would hope to put the UFB cables down, and someone is either not responding or doesn't want it there? Well, for homes down right-of-ways, no consent will be required, though 5 days' notice must be given if a fibre cable installation is non-invasive. And I'm told that's if it's a shallow hole under grass. So if it's an easy job, no consent required, though you have to give 5 days' notice of it being given. For apartments, a UFB installer, I'm told, will get deemed consent and be able to proceed if they're not heard from the body corporate for within 15 days. So if you give notice and you don't get any feedback, after 15 days in an apartment, you should be good to go, and there's the right for the UFB installer to go and get stuck in and put the cable in. If the installation is categorised as invasive, because it involves major work will proceed if no neighbours on the shared right-of-way object. So slightly more complicated, obviously a notification period, but if no one says no, then on that right-of-way, then again, you can go fill your boots and go and make sure that the cable is installed. That will create a solution to many people out there who have been frustrated with the lack of connection through UFB. The UFB is extremely important, not just to the families who use it to watch Netflix or do whatever, but also in terms of the economic growth that this government put so much weight in terms of the UFB rollout. But I would like to stress again, they got all excited, said, here's the UFB. Some people put up their hands, including the telecommunications companies, and said, hey guys, there's a slight detail here with us being able to roll this out to everybody in terms of apartments, right-of-ways and body corporates, but the government didn't listen. And we're here doing another patch-up on an extremely important piece of legislation that this government has trumpeted since it came into office since 2008. And it's trying to usher it through late on a Tuesday night with them taking very few calls because they feel a bit guilty. They feel just a little bit guilty. Because we don't want to talk about it for very long, because it's something that we should have done 4 years ago. 4 years ago. So I could go and find some of the emails that I had from constituents from right around the country who said, hey, why isn't the government listening to us on this one? And I don't think they are watching tonight, because I think they've given up all hope on the government to do anything about it. But help is on its way, because the Labor Party will support this piece of legislation. It's late, it's bad, because the government should have done it much, much earlier. And again, I have some sympathy for Amy Adams. I don't expect Amy Adams to be sending a Christmas card to Stephen Joyce this year, because in terms of parliamentary hospital passes, he's thrown her an absolute doozy.
Alfred Ngaro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to take just a brief call on the